then everybody's about 24. You're about 25 or 50. 24 is not an about number, right? I thought we'd start today by having Ken answer questions from last week. As I understand it, he and Pete vigorously debated the electoral college. Some of you thought was the electrical college. And that there was not much time for Q&A. Do we want to just spend a few minutes on the electoral college and its support or abolition? Not all at once.
I think it needs amendments to clarify certain aspects of it. We're not going to get rid of it in one vote.
Hold it up.
We're not going to get rid of the electoral college with one vote. First, we have to amend it so it's not so porous that it can be manipulated.
How many here, by show of hands, believe there will be changes to the electoral college? By the way, I'm not raising my hand. I not to say I don't think, I made it clear here before, I don't think we should change it, I think we should simply abolish it. But that said, my expectation is absolutely no change. Ken, you're the...
Well, the one change that can take place is what Maine and Nebraska do. They prorate the number of votes they have by district voting. So any state can do that.
And I suppose that could happen. I guess I think of the things democratic in our system, the undemocratic, the electoral college, the Senate, the gerrymandering effect of every census, those three things that seem to me to distort democracy beyond recognition. I'm not optimistic that we'll change them. Sadly, Don Maley has been speaking to the Legacy Group for the last 5 or 6 weeks about democracy. And I've had an opportunity to read his material. It's really well written. But it comes to a sad conclusion, which is democracy may not continue here. John, you want to elaborate on that at all?
Well, I just think
Yeah,
can't really trust this guy at all. It just seems to me that the deterioration of our ability to deal with, to live with each other as people is growing and growing and growing. And we are the problem. That's not the system. It's not the problem. We are the problem, and we're not going away, and we're getting worse, if you will. Our own attitudes and this is being affected by, to a great extent, really great extent, by the new what's it called?
So thus far, you've been very clear.
There's too much.
Telephones?
No.
Okay.
Social media. Social media is just conversing with everybody, and most people, at least I would say most people, do not know how to handle it.
I agree. Charlie?
right. Can I do?
I think the threat to democracy is more from outside rather than inside.
Elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think we're facing right now a very serious threat from Russia, China, Iran, and if democracy ends, it's going to be because of them, not because of us.
You know, I understand that position. I read something just similar on that point earlier today about our handling of Russia and China together. In years, decades past, I think we have managed to kind of keep them at odds with each other and benefited hugely from that. In the course of the last very short period of time, 2 or 3 years, we've more or less, it seems to me, this article argued, pushed them together for them to be united. That's a massive force, actually. I mean, Russia is basically a dwindling oil stick that would be unimportant totally if they didn't have nukes. but China is a big deal. And Russia, with their nukes being out of control, which we'll talk about Ukraine in a minute. But back on the Electoral College, I think it would be interesting to talk about the other legs of that quasi or non-democratic system. Again, I say the Senate and gerrymandered congressional races. The three together, Electoral College, allocation of senators by states, to me, bring an almost certain end to democracy as we've known it. There's not going to be much incentive for the middle of the country, between the coasts, all the states in that group having 2 senators. There's not going to be much incentive for them to do anything other than vote together to exclude the coasts, if that makes any sense. And the Electoral College is but one way that happens, which is why I don't support it. Should we go to today? I suggested that we begin this morning with Doug updating us on the Canadian trucker scandal. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug. There's a button here.
Am I on now? I guess I am on now. Okay. First, I've tried to update this information as of 9:31 this morning. But this is, as we're sitting here right now, the Ottawa police have started attempting to clear the protesters from this downtown Ottawa after 22 days. Okay, what is this all about? It's about the Canadian vaccine mandate, and specifically one provision of it. Any citizens and permanent residents who are entering Canada and are unvaccinated must self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, as the information I had is estimated 85% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated. Now, we need to know a little bit about the background of the truckers themselves. These truckers driving by themselves all night long have plenty of time to cogitate on all the things that should be different and all the people that are making their life more difficult. So that's kind of like if these guys wanted to work in a factory and punch a clock and so forth, they could, but they want the independent life of being a trucker. And more specifically of how the trucking industry would actually operate in Canada. As in the United States, in Canada, the freight flows are unbalanced to the west. There's more freight going west than coming east. So let's say you're a trucker in Toronto, very east, you get a full load and you're driving west to Winnipeg. Now when you get to Winnipeg and you want to go back to Toronto, you got a couple options. One, you can hang around waiting for a load and you're not making any money while you're waiting around. Or you could just surrender and drive back to Toronto empty and absorb all the cost of driving all the way back to Toronto. Now I have talked with one of the head of a trucking company in Winnipeg, and he has another option. What he does, he gets the load from Toronto to Winnipeg, then his driver picks up a load in Winnipeg and drives to Chicago. In Chicago, he picks up another full load and drives back to Toronto. So he's got 3 full loads and no empty miles, and that's how he handles his operation. Now with this vaccine mandate, what happens when the driver shows up at the Canadian border in New York trying to enter Ontario, he has to quarantine for 14 days if he has not been vaccinated. And that's kind of what started this. Right now, the goal of the protesters is actually the elimination of all COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Now, this protest has been progressing for 22 days. The police have ramped up the pressure. First they said, no one can bring food or fuel to the protesters. Now this is winter, it's in Ottawa. Winter nights, I've looked them up, they can be 10, 12, 13 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at night. What's happened is that many Canadians have braved the police crackdown and delivered food and fuel to the protesters. Remember, the Canadian people are famed for their niceness and are not known for civil disobedience. In addition, Trudeau invoked a 1988 Emergency Act. And this followed up on a previous law, was the War Measures Act. And that act was only used 3 times: World War I, World War II, and against some terrorists in Quebec in 1970. Basically, he said there's a threat of violence and unrest, and there's supply chain disruptions. And you have to remember, in Canada, there's a tremendous amount of north-south cross-border traffic, much more so than we have in the United States. Now, it is illegal for protesters or their supporters to enter downtown Ottawa. And Ottawa, Ontario, the province of Ontario, has threatened to revoke the driver's licenses of the protesters. Now the Children's Aid Society of Ottawa has piled on. They've issued a notice urging parents at the protest make arrangements in case they are unable to care for their children after police intervene. And I wrote down here, this is yesterday, I wrote down here, it appears that law enforcement is ready to move against the protesters. That's in motion right now. Trudeau said it's just decisions about dealing with protesters that would be left to the police. And the Emergency Act does provide police with tools they can use to make sure the laws are enforced. Now, on these emergency powers, these must be, after they're invoked, which they have been by Trudeau, they must be approved by Parliament. Actually, today, the Parliament session has been canceled because of the disruptions associated with the police trying to break up the protests. Let's see. Parliament must approve the continued use of the emergency powers. The left-leaning New Democratic Party is likely to support Trudeau's Liberals, which should be enough votes to ensure passage. And right now, they're hoping to have a vote on this Monday evening. What else do I have here? Oh, yeah. Under the war, also the Canadian Finance Minister has announced that they have begun the process to freeze protesters' bank accounts. Tow trucks. Under the War Powers Act, the police do have the power to compel tow trucks. But this has been somewhat impaired because the tow trucks in large measure have kind of absented themselves from the area. To give you just one quote here, this is Jordan Peterson. He's a Canadian psychologist and author, some of you may know. He called on Trudeau, quote, to open the damn country back up, and lamenting that his homeland is becoming increasingly authoritarian. Although the police, we'll see what happened today. Right now, initially, they've started towing automobiles, but they're going to have to get the automobiles towed. They'll get to all the heavy-duty Class 8 tractors that are there. The government may win this round, but I'm just going to suggest I don't think it's over. And so,
May I just ask a question on it? You say that this guy, this Gordon Peterson, is his name?
Pardon?
The man you quoted,
Jordan Peterson?
Jordan Peterson,
Yes.
was talking about the actions of Trudeau to end the strike as authoritarian, or the strike itself as authoritarian?
Well, his quote was to open the country back up, and I think by that he was referring to the vaccine mandates. But it would clearly be a statement in support of the protesters.
Yeah, Jordan's was.
Yeah.
How many of you here, just by show of hands, are familiar enough with this that you are prepared to take a position, at least vote, don't need anything, but taking notes. How many would favor the position of the protesters against the mandates? How many favor the position of the government against the protesters? You know, as much as we may try to never be left-right, we are always left-right. It's just amazing. You know, I have to say, Phoebe?
What about the idea of a peaceful protest? Why do we have all these people up here in Ottawa with guns, not just pistols, and the glove compartment, but long rifles and AK-50s? Those have been seized. There's a picture of them in the New York Times yesterday. That's not a peaceful protest when you come fully armed for mayhem.
Well said. I can't imagine the presence of long guns at Democratic rallies increases the democracy ever. And whoever does it, then it's sad. On the other hand, if I'm trying to protest something, I can't imagine much better than an A-class tractor to park in the middle of the road. That's a big protest.
I'm not aware of any weapons being used other than the tractors themselves being parked in downtown Ottawa.
I don't think they were used. This article says they were found in the trucks that they were. How did they get into the trucks? I thought the trucks were not being bothered yet.
On remote, for a trucker in remote areas, it's not unusual for them to carry a weapon.
I'd be shocked if they
But
didn't.
not AK-15 rifles.
Go ahead. Caroline?
I'm just reading this article from last night at 9:20 that they arrested somebody called Tamara Lip,
I saw
who was
that.
one of the truckers' protest main organizer. Can you tell us anything about that?
I think they were charged with abetting criminal mischief. Yes, they were bodily arrested. Yes, that would be a leader of the protest. Yes.
Right.
I read the same material, and I have no doubt to question the truth of that.
Right. And I read that a lot of money is coming from the United States to support this. Is that a fact?
That I don't know. There are GoFundMe on the internet to help with the food and the fuel. And I guess the way that GoFundMe is set up, they really can't tell where it's coming from. So it's certainly possible that money could be coming from America to support the food and fuel for the truckers that were in the protest.
Yeah. Please, Sarah?
My question is, you say 85% of the truckers are vaccinated.
Yeah.
Are they being allowed through, or are they being stopped also?
Everything stopped.
Everything is stopped.
In Ottawa. So
The people that are vaccinated can get in with a recent negative test.
I got you. Okay. And then of the 15% that are not vaccinated, how many is that in numbers, just roughly? I mean, is it 1,000 or 10,000? Just roughly.
I don't know. Canada's maybe 1/10 the United States.
Oh, okay.
It's got to be, I say Canada. Help me out there, Bill. It would be thousands of drivers, yes.
That's close enough.
But see, the problem is that a greater percentage of Canadian truckers are driving internationally. That's the challenge. See, in the United States, drivers, the percentage of American truck drivers that are crossing the Canadian border is a much lower percentage than it is in Canada.
But just to follow up on that, Sarah, what percentage of American truckers are vaccinated? Is it the same 62, 64 as the rest of the population? I think it's higher.
90%.
I'm sorry, of American truckers? I thought Canadian truckers were more heavily vaccinated than Americans, but I don't know.
More vaccinated in Canada than in...
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. You know, please, John.
I heard some rumblings. What's the possibility of this protest spreading in the United States?
Well, this is a protest specifically against Canadian regulations. I would expect it would spread some within Canada, and the most likely place for it to spread is to the international border crossings. The Ambassador Bridge in Detroit would be a target. the bridges going into Ontario, but any international, I read that there was an international, in Coutts, Alberta, there was some protests there. But to me, this could spring up at any of the international border crossings.
Go ahead, Sue. And over to Bill.
It kind of defies logic. If the 15% of the truckers get sick or any proportion of them, it will only increase the chance that the country will shut down again. So what is the point? There's no logic.
What's the point of what?
The point would be that the 15% that are unvaccinated are forced to quarantine, which either means that they, as a practical matter, they can't do international trucking, or they got to find another line of work. It's really it's support of those that have chosen to not be vaccinated.
Bill.
Yeah, another important point here to point out is that border crossing between Detroit and Canada is probably, as you mentioned, is probably one of the busiest, because that's all automotive traffic. Tremendous amount of the production of auto parts and vehicles moves back and forth across that, so that's going to have a continuing huge impact on both economies.
It seems to me there are two issues here. One is this whole issue of vaccination mandates, and whether or not they should have been imposed, should still be imposed. Are they going to be there forever? I can't imagine it. Are we going to have, a year from now, anti-vaxxers protesting one way or another, either at the border or elsewhere? Or does this issue go away? So that's one issue, the question of mandates, and are the government forced us to do something we may choose not to do. And the other is the method of protest, shutting Ottawa down, and thus impacting our automobile industry, and many other things beyond that. As a liberal protester, let me tell you, I find it very odd that we come to accept that kind of protest. Big trucks in the street, shutting borders down. I think that really has dangers to the population.
Hi, Bob.
I'm sorry, Jim.
It's okay. I think those are issues. I think there are a couple of other issues that we're not touching on. One of them is very, very central to this whole event, and that is Trudeau is not talking to the people that are protesting and trying to have their voices heard. So why wouldn't he just take a representative, 4 or 5 guys from the trucking that are representing the protesters, bring them into his chambers and talk to them about how he can help alleviate the problem? Just standing up at the podium and talking to them over the airways is, in my opinion, a dead wrong way to go about doing it. That's number one. Number two is escaping me. I must be getting older.
Maybe you said 1 or 2.
Maybe I'll go to number 3. That's good. Good idea. I've seen you use that yourself several times.
I'm reserving 2 for my use.
But I'll think of it in a minute. Thanks.
How does it end? Where do we go from here? The place where I assume arrest protesters.
Yes. There'll be protesters that are going to be arrested in jail, and they'll eventually get the tow trucks to move the tractors to move them out. But it'll spring up someplace else or other places until the underlying question is the necessity of the vaccine mandates that they have in Canada. And the one that set it off was a quarantine requirement for an unvaccinated person who's had, they have a negative test. They're coming in the country with a negative test, but they have to quarantine.
Because they're not vaccinated, right? Ken?
My understanding is that some law or regulation or change is to occur on March the 1st. Do you know what that is?
On March, in Canada?
In Canada.
Oh, I didn't check that far ahead, no. That's possible.
But I understand is you're gonna move up the maypole dance. Tomorrow. To me, this issue is symptomatic of the whole divide between left and right. I'm not sure how I feel about mandated vaccination, although I do think it's odd. I can't imagine anything like vaccination splitting between Republican and Democrat. What's political about a vaccination? And maybe what makes it political is a mandate. How many here are not vaccinated? I'm not asking you to confess to the great sin, but my guess is none. I think we all, as a group, got vaccinated. Do you all feel, any of you feel that we were forced to do that?
The vulnerable population.
There's a difference there, Bob, in the sense that we essentially are an integrated community, we care for each other, and by moving to Vickers, we intentionally joined a community. And I think that's the difference. And so, people, we got the vaccination with gratitude and with free will,
Yeah.
to basically, not only for ourselves, but for our friends who are living here. And the trouble is that there is not, Trudeau has not attempted to establish that kind of relationship with the protesters, for example.
Well, and that goes back to Jim's comment, and I agree with it. I think the idea of any politician not talking to opposition or to his supporters seems to be senseless. But I do think that the question of the government's right to mandate things, whether it be a vaccination or seatbelts or driver's licenses. I mean, we have government mandates all around us. And I generally think that speaking, I think most of us would agree that most of those mandates are sensible, right? Or am I wrong? But is the idea of mandated seatbelts something objectionable to?
No, but it took a very long, wait, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to scream it. It took an extraordinarily long time for people to adapt to seatbelts. I have two friends who do not use seatbelts to this day because they resented the fact that they were mandated. And, I mean, we could change that word mandate to suggest, maybe lighten up on the force end of it and, kind of convince people that this is a safe thing to do. But the anti-vaxxers have always been alive and well, and this COVID brought out more, huge, bigger numbers and so forth.
I was going to say, we're never been 35% of the population.
Yeah.
What about the misinformation?
Oh, the internet is unbelievable. I mean, what's happening on the internet, we could go on about that for hours, is, children are committing suicide because of fake pills and being bullied and everything else. So the internet, God knows what Russia is doing on the internet, all these big, huge powers. If in fact, in the middle school, people are, taking party pills that are killing them, it's based with fentanyl. Obviously.
Which is, thank you very much, directly related to the issue of the truckers.
Not at all. Unless they're bringing in the fentanyl. And they may be.
It's 10:30, and we exhausted the truckers, or do you want to talk about more, Ken?
I just want to raise the issue of other unions. Are unions supporting the truckers at all? And I would also mention, I was in New York City during the subway strikes, and they talk about the population being affected. And the union would always win because Mayor Lindsay or some others, they'd have to give in. So I don't know about unions supporting the truckers.
Well, I'm sure the truckers in the protest here are not a member of the Teamsters Union. And the power of the Teamsters Union has been substantially reduced in the last 40 years. 40 years ago, the LTL trucking, long-haul LTL trucking industry was 100% Teamster. Today, the percentage is significantly less than 18%.
Oh my God, really?
Yes, the truckload part of the trucking industry is virtually non-union. And the short-haul business is mostly non-union.
I was thinking of other unions supporting their effort.
Pardon?
I was asking about, are there other unions supporting the truckers? That normally would happen.
Just the internet work I've done the last couple of days, I didn't see any unions supporting the truckers, no.
Yeah, I put a marker down somewhere. I'd like to devote one of our conversations here to the demise of unions and what's caused that. Will it ever change? To go from near 100% to 18%, especially for mostly independent contractors. Aren't most truckers independent contractors?
No, many,
Work for-
probably in the truckload, there's probably, I don't know what the divide is, but many companies are company employees, but they're also independent contractors. J.B. Hunt went to the largest company. They're all employees.
All employees.
All employees. Yeah, if you have employees, you have more control. And if you have more control, it's easier to provide the service to the customer. If you, not that you can't do it with contractors.
Do you believe many of those truckers in Ottawa are part of that 18% union, or you think none?
So I think the ones in Ottawa would be independent contractors.
The whole issue of unions, their relevance to the economy today, is something we can talk about, I think, at a different time. But I'd like to tee that up. If it's all right, I'd like to move on to another topic now. I'm sorry, Jim, did you remember?
Yeah, well, yeah. I thought about the third one. The third one is, you remember, those of you who were here for Doug's and my presentation on the supply chain.
Very good.
Well, thank you. You may remember that the power of central price setting on freight went away. And prior to that time, when price setting for the cost of transportation was a governmental function, there was a study done when we were having inflation, and the allegation was that much of the inflation was being caused by the increases in freight rates, which was being driven in the hypothesis by the unions, by the Teamster union. And the study was performed, and they discovered every time the government raised the freight rates, the benefit of that did not go to the trucking companies; it went to the truckers. So the point is that the unions were having power in helping the truckers raise their income. And when they lost the ability of the U.S. government to control price for them, that lever to acquire membership went away. And when that went away, they devolved from near 100% to the current 18 or 13% that they now cover. So it was all about losing the power of the government pricing function that took that away from them and removed the need for that particular need.
So in the absence of government pricing, the central entity, a single entity setting the price, in the absence of that, you've got a billion independent contractors, in effect, buying the truck or charging the truck,
no.
and those independent contractors negotiate their separate prices?
No, everyone, whoever they are, can separate to negotiate. As Doug said, the large trucking companies don't have owner-operators, they have employees. But whoever they are can set their own, can negotiate their own price. So when you've got an imbalance of freight between the east and the west of Canada, for example, and you're trying to move something on the route that has the heaviest traffic, everybody wants that, and so it's a lower price. So the price setting devolves to supply demand is what it amounts to. So anyway, that's the function there. The other point, the point number two, however, just to take it a quick aside, is one of the things that the whole Canadian trucking experience has taught me is that, again, it's demonstrated the power of big tech. When the GoFundMe folks decided to just take the $10 million that had been given to them to pass on to the truckers, GoFundMe decided to not give it to them, just unilaterally not give it to them, and they were going to give it to charities of their own choosing. Now, to me, that's a problem, and that's an indication of the kind of problem that further power and big tech is going to create for us, that's all.
To go through a little history of when freight rates were regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission. Essentially, it was a cost-plus system. The carriers would add the freight bureaus around the country. They would present their cases for a rate increase. It was rational. They indicated what their costs were, et cetera, and they got the increases. When freight rates were deregulated in 1980, that process ended. And then you had companies, the leading one at the time was Overnight, which is now UPS Freight, but they were non-union at the time, and so they cut their rates. You know, you couldn't cut your rates before. And
Did they cut their rates below cost to squeeze people out of the industry?
Well, you couldn't cut your rates against the less efficient competition. See, Overnight could cut the rates because they were non-union.
More efficient, yeah.
And I probably should say here, in terms of the labor cost, when you have Teamster wages on the one hand and you have, let's say, non-union wages on the other, they're not that much different. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, the Teamster rates are a little bit higher. That's not necessarily a negative, because if you have the somewhat higher rates, it reduces turnover. You reduce turnover, you have a higher safety performance, you have lower workers' comp expense, you have lower claims expense so there are financial benefits to the company as a whole with having a more experienced workforce. The big difference is that the non-union companies don't have the health, welfare, and pension to deal with, which the unionized companies do, and those plans are, for the most case, operated by the union. Now, UPS is an exception because several years ago, UPS paid, what, $3 billion or something, I'm not exaggerating here, $3 billion to the Central States plan to have the UPS no longer in there. Now they have their own company plan.
Wow. You know, the whole question of unionization and its relevance to the economy today, its relevance to the current level of income of the middle class, is one I think we could talk about at a future meeting. It's a big topic. And how many, anybody here a union member? How many of you have been a member of a union? Super. You were a union member.
I was a member of the United Mine Workers District.
You were a member of the mine workers?
Yes. I worked in a pig factory, loading ball mills with dry stock.
And Ken, what union were you a part of?
The electrical union.
I love it.
The what?
The electrical union.
The electrical union in New York City.
UAW. I worked for 1 week in a General Motors.
I'm not altogether sure we count that. But let's tee up, we'll talk about unions one in a future time. Right now, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. Does anybody want to tee it up? Yeah, let me tee it up. Everybody understands a little bit, I guess, about the history of the Russian involvement in Ukraine, which is, let's call it, is it about 8 years ago that Crimea was taken over? I think roughly. And since that time, the Donbass region, which connects Crimea to Russia, and there's Luhansk and Donetsk, I think, are the two cities in that part of Ukraine. Over 600,000, I think, of the residents of that Donbass area have now been given Russian passports. Almost all of the people in that area speak Russian, many as their native tongue. And Russia's argument is we have Crimea, I guess it's kind of, we took that and nobody stopped us, so now we need to connect to it. I find the logic behind that pretty shaky. But I can understand if I were a Russian, moving in that direction would make some sense. Jenny?
Just to give you a little more background, the Crimea Peninsula at one time was a part of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev, when he was the head of the Soviet Union, was also from the Ukraine. In a nice gesture, he gave the Crimean Peninsula back to Ukraine.
So when I visited Ukraine, it was more Russian than it was Ukrainian. The Russians were there, the Soviet Navy rented a port there. It was no surprise to me that that ended up with Putin taking it over because the sentiment of the people there, but there was Russian social clubs, all kinds of things. So you're taking over a part of an area that at one time was part of the Soviet Union. Not saying that Putin has the right to take over all of Ukraine, but that particular part made sense in a way to a lot of people.
Yeah, unfortunately, Jay, for me at least, the argument that they were once part of the Soviet Union falls flat. I mean, a host of countries were once part of the Soviet Union, some of which are now part of NATO. On the one hand, I certainly understand and to some extent sympathize with their desire to connect one country they stole to their homeland by stealing yet more countries. But that's what I consider it to be. Nonetheless, what's at risk today is not just the Donbass. What's at risk today is troops coming in from Belarus, which is to the north of Ukraine, and all along the eastern border. And what is it, 150,000, 147,000 troops as of this week, and debates as to whether they're going to increase or decrease. Personally, I'm shocked to think that in 2022, we're talking about sovereign countries attacking other sovereign countries. I thought that was really settled at the end of the Cold War, at least. And it's very disturbing to me to think that we're returning to an era of Cold War politics, adding land masses to countries. Doug?
I'm going to look at it from a different angle here. One, Russia and China have an alliance, however strong it might be. But China has their bullseye focused on Taiwan. And I think that Putin is probing the Ukraine here like a chess player, just to see what kind of reaction is going to happen.
Very, very good point.
And China, of course, is watching because they could care less about the Ukraine, but they want Taiwan. And I think that's what Putin is doing here, is basically doing some probing on China.
Will the United States will anybody actually act in defense of Donbass, and presumably the same defense would exist for Taiwan? That's a very good point. What happens next? How do we undo or back out of the position we're in? And I say all the countries in the world have a dog in the fight if one sovereign nation is attacking another sovereign nation. Charlie?
Well, I was going to say something similar to that. I think more important is what is the reaction of the United States going to be? Are we going to sit back and just keep checking to see how far it goes? And I don't know what the limit is, but I do think that Putin is testing us. Or are we going to take a strong reaction and perhaps take some risk? I think that's the question now is, what is the U.S. going to do? We're going to draw a red line?
Our success with red lines over the years has not been very good. But
I'd like to suggest we've already taken our risk. The vice president's over there taking care of the whole thing.
I forgot about that. So let's move on to the topic that is resolved. Poor young lady. Anyway, listen, where do we go next? Any ideas about how we, the United States, should increase or decrease our involvement or our efforts to stop the Russians? Should we let it happen since we don't really have a dog in that fight? Don?
Come on, Captain. Move.
We need younger runners.
No, it seems to me we can't do anything. Well, physically we can't do anything, and we're not going to do anything. The question is, what economically will we do? And it seems at the moment that the whole European Union is really means to Russia, I don't know, but they seem to think it's going to be well, it will have an effect. Now, if we try to relate that then to Taiwan, Taiwan doesn't seem to be an entirely different physical situation. Taiwan's sitting out in the middle of the ocean. We've got a naval force in the Western Pacific, and the Eastern Pacific, I should say. And if anything happens there, I suggest it's not going to be economic. It's going to be physical.
Certainly.
If the pipeline from Russia to Western Europe is cut off, either by them or by all the other nations, yes, the Western Europe will suffer. Russia will go into a financial collapse because I think that's their major source of revenue. So then what happens?
Well, while it is true that it's the major source of revenue to the Russians, it's also the major source of energy to Europe. And how in the world Europe survived for more than days without Russian gas, I don't know. And I think that's a bigger stick, frankly, than our financial weight. I think Zelensky growing his set is a big change over the last few weeks. He has been trying to dance between the Soviet, or Russia and the West, and in the last 3 or 4 days, I think he's now speaking out against Russia and part, I guess, because we've been supplying so much money and arms to strengthen them in their defense against the Russians. It's, I think, important to watch for a whole host of reasons. But one is this whole, what's the U.S. role in trying to inject some U.S. gas into the European supply? And the weaker the link between Russia and Western Europe, the more likely the Europeans are, Western Europeans are, to pay the higher price of delivered gas in the United States. And it's a significantly higher price. The difference between pipeline gas cost, and LNG, gasified at the point of delivery in Europe. We have to take natural gas here, liquefy it, ship it, gasify it, and use it. And that adds a huge amount of cost. And particularly when compared to the Russian pipe gas.
Okay, that process is economic today. European gas prices are about 4 times ours. And I think on just about every U.S. LNG ship is en route or is docked in Europe with gas. And if we were to increase the fracking here, that would produce even more gas. So the United States could basically, I think, replace that Russian pipeline gas.
That complicates, seems to me, go ahead, Jacques.
Yes, what Doug said is true. I mean, the port of Rotterdam, for example, today is saturated. So many tankers bring liquefied gas to it. But then about the economic sanction, something that put around my head since we talked about the sanctions is it's not very clear to me what the impact is going to be. Okay, but then there is another question. It is that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. They're going to be they're going to be there, and I don't know what will happen to the political system then there. But how long are we going to be there? I mean, are we going to have sanctions and give back Ukraine? You see what I mean?
Excellent question. I mean, are we doing much to say get back Crimea? I don't think there's a hell of a lot going on. Maybe there is, to be honest.
This is puzzling me. I mean, it has been a discussion between some people, maybe in this country, but I think it's I don't know which, it's not the same. But
doing before they invade Ukraine, or are we going to wait till they're going to invade Ukraine to with the sanction? This is a problem which, you know, it's interesting. It's because when we have done the sanction after Ukraine is invaded, but does it make sense to do sanctions? They decided to take over Ukraine, but it was sanctions up, you know. So they made up that mind, and what are the consequences? And I think about Russia, and we have to think about a country which is extremely resilient, you know. I mean, the Second World War proved it, you know, and then the extremely nationalistic, that is to say, the moment that they feel that we're against them, we penalize them, they're going to be like this together and said, I'm going to eat my shoes, but I am in Russia.
You know, the interesting question, well said, Jock. The interesting question, assume for a moment that the Ukrainians can't withstand a Russian onslaught, and the Russians then own Ukraine. Somewhat similar, I assume, to what they own Belarus. Do they leave Zelensky in place and hope he becomes a puppet like the Belarusian president? Possibly. What do we do then? Do we sanction Russian Ukraine? Do we penalize the people who live there because the Russians conquered it? I don't know.
If I could add to that thought, I don't think the issue is what happens to Ukraine. I think the issue is what does Putin want? I don't think he wants Ukraine. I think he wants the eastern part of Ukraine, which, as you point out, connects him with Crimea. And in fact, I think to the question of what are we going to do, I think we've already done it. Number one, we said we're not going to send troops. Number two, our president has said limited incursion might not be sanctioned. Number three, we've already moved our embassy from Kiev all the way over to the Polish border. So, you know, we're situated to let him take over that part of Ukraine. And so there still will be a Ukraine, it just will be much smaller. That's all. That's my opinion.
I thought for a brief moment we moved to what I consider to be a very positive story for the Democratic Party. I know not all of you here are Democrats, but 3 young people in San Francisco were just kicked out of their offices by the Democratic Party in a recall. I don't know how many of you followed that. But in effect, the California Democratic Party said, we're not that radical. We believe in a moderate, tilt left, but a moderate approach. And apparently, these 3 young people spent most of their terms renaming schools.
I think you should mention these are 3 former members of the San Francisco School Board.
Precisely. Yeah. And thus an interest in the school thing. But, you know, and I thought at the beginning of that whole renaming thing, especially when it got to renaming George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson, we've truly reached the end of sanity. And I'm delighted to think that the San Francisco Democrats had the good sense to say, not this.
And it wasn't a close vote either.
No, 73% or something like that. I mean, frankly, for anybody who cares about the life of the Democratic Party, this is good news, as I do.
Well, I might say, as not necessarily a member of the Democratic Party, but I was pleased to see some rationality, and maybe it's a return of the Democratic Party to its more traditional roots.
Exactly. Although I really am offended by the idea of a school named Lincoln. Spend our time on that, shouldn't we? Inflation. How many of you are feeling that? Actually, I don't know whether we are or not. Sal, you're raising your hand and you buy the groceries, so.
Yes.
What was it, was it really 9% increase or something like that?
9% for the producer price index, 7.4% for the
And is that a
retail.
forward face of what's gonna happen to?
Yes, it's coming through the system, right?
Jim, Sally Ann.
That's okay. You asked the question, I answered it. I do see inflation in grocery stores and everywhere else, in restaurants. We were in a restaurant recently that's already over the top expensive. I mean, really expensive in Miami Beach called Doro. And at the end of the meal, or the end of the check, it said there was an automatic 30% tip. That's really, that hits you kind of square in the face, which is why we stay home and eat here, which seems like a really great bargain now.
I don't know, I think there's when I own those here. You know, how to manage an economy coming out of COVID, to me, is really going to be a challenge. And I don't think it's all anybody's fault. This god-awful pandemic has affected all of our lives during these 2 years. And I'd be shocked if the economy wasn't broken in some place or another. Getting it right, I think, is going to take another year. I don't think it's a consequence, and maybe this is just hopeful thinking, it's a consequence of the Biden infrastructure bill or his first bill, the COVID relief bill. Admittedly, that's a lot of cash to put into a country, into an economic system, and that clearly had inflationary impact. But I think there are other things broken or out of place in the economy. Until they're put in the right place, we're not going to see a rational.
Well, the Federal Reserve has been putting billions and billions of dollars into the economy for, 2 years?
Oh, at least, yeah. Certainly the term of the
You know, if you have that much cash floating around and the stuff that people spend it on is not increased likewise, then the
prices go up.
That's what happens.
It's near 11 o'clock. Do any of you have any issues that are current? Because we're current events.
Bob, can I make a quick announcement?
Please.
This doesn't have to do with current events, but if anybody would like free tickets to the symphony concert this Saturday night, the concert is Beethoven to Brahms, and the bus will be leaving at 6:30. We still have seats on the bus, and I still have 10 tickets left. Vickers is one of the sponsors of this concert, so if you're interested in going and would like tickets, just stop and see me after the meeting. Thank you.
And delightfully, neither Beethoven nor Brahms are current. A wonderful concert. See you all next Friday morning. Oh, by the way, a couple of things that are going to happen in our near future. Thanks to Fran, I had lunch with her son-in-law last week, a delightful young man. He's headed Pepsi and Kentucky Fried Chicken, a lot of things internationally. It's an incredible experience. But he has become involved in an environmental group, and we're talking about organizing a 2 or 3 meeting discussion of environmental problems. What to do about the environment. It'll include a discussion of global warming. It'll talk about a whole range of other issues that the environmental community is interested in. If any of you have some suggestions for that focused discussion, please suggest some speakers. I'd like to hear them. I've asked Larry Swain, Fran's son-in-law, to put together a couple of people. He's going to bring a professor from UNF. We might, if we could find somebody from JDA who can talk about what the utility is doing regarding the environment. And maybe there's an environmental officer now. In fact, there is. There's an environmental officer of city government. A young woman has recently been appointed. Maybe we can get her to come join us. But I think a 2 or 3 week discussion of environmental issues and environmental solutions. Does that make sense? I'm sorry?
Sounds good.
Good. And I'm sure there are governmental authorities throughout the country waiting with bated breath for suggestions from Vickers Landing. Thank you all. See you next week.